Hello everyone. So got a bit of time today, so I'm going to do the whole of Amber Heard's appeal, and I'm going to be looking at it. And what I'm going to do, so I've got 16 cases. I find it really hard to follow, and I've said this before. I'm not a lawyer, so I refer to lawyers to pull it apart. And the best summary that I found was the one by Andrea Burkhart. So what she did was that she looked at all the different 16 assignments of error and then looked at which ones they spent the most time over with the most page numbers and the words used. And so she discovered that four of them had more time spent in them. So they're the four that I've focused on. I've done separate videos on these, but I'm going to do these all in one spot. So the four were number one, the UK judgment. The number two was the decision to have it in Virginia instead of either California or New York. Number three was the medical records, and by medical records we mean psychology or psychiatric records. And number four was the damages. So I'm going to go over these each in turn. So the first one is the UK judgment. So just to repeat what I said before, the fact that we had a UK judgment is something that Amber Heard's team has said, well, they shouldn't have had this because, and the reason is, and a lot of people think, oh, you can have the same trial in the US and you've had it in UK, they're completely separate. That's not true. Because actually, if you are tried in one country and then the other country hears the case, they're not allowed to try. So this is an international law sort of situation. Now, there might be some countries that just don't agree with that and they'll try it anyway, but you're not really allowed to. So if you're found guilty of something, tough luck, you can't appeal it in a different country. If you're found not guilty, you can't appeal it in another country. You have to appeal it in the same country. So you can't appeal it. You can't just say, okay, you lost in the UK, we've gone to a different country, we're going to appeal it. Doesn't work like that. So if Johnny Depp had sued Amber Heard in the UK and lost, and then he came to the US and sued her again, he wouldn't be able to. So, and you would have had this difficulty. So, let's say he in the UK trial was actually against her. Now he had every right to sue her, but he didn't. He sued the newspaper instead. And part of the reason for that was because, well, they'd had a divorce proceeding in which she promised not to badmouth him. And she got what's actually $33 million, but $7 million of which was cash. She got that on the condition that she didn't badmouth him. And he wasn't allowed to badmouth her either. But so he didn't think she'd broken that. He had no evidence that she'd broken that. So he had to sue the newspaper. But had he sued her, even if he'd sued her and the newspaper and then lost, he wouldn't be allowed to sue her in the US. Now, he still might be because it would be a different issue, but he wouldn't be able to sue her on the same issue. But even the fact that he didn't sue her and she was just a witness, there's still an argument that says she was effectively the defendant because it was effectively suing her. And if they'd won that argument, you wouldn't be able to have it in the US or any other country. Of course, there's another argument that says, well, that was 2016's defamation, this is 2018's. Just because you say that she didn't defame him in 2016 doesn't mean that she did defame him in 2018. But the issue there, and the problem there, is that what she said in 2016 is essentially the same as what she said in 2018. So she said in 2016 to the Sun newspaper, said he was a wife beater. In the 2018, she said directly in her op-ed to the Washington Post that she was a figure of domestic violence because of him. And she said because of 2 years ago, just referring to what she said to the Sun newspaper and others. So it's the same issue. So the fact that it's 2 years later, if he was, well, if she was not guilty of defaming him in 2016, repeating the same thing in 2018 cannot be guilty. But he didn't sue her. And this is the thing. Now she can say, oh, but he was proven. But he wasn't proven. Because all that was tested in the UK was whether the Sun were misrepresenting what she told them. They didn't prove whether or not she was telling the truth. Now, she was telling the truth as far as being a witness is concerned, but the level of truth that you have to give as a defendant is higher than being a witness. So basically, the main thing is that as a witness, yes, you have to tell the truth, but you don't have to tell the whole truth because you can't be asked about certain things. But if you're a defendant, you can be asked for what they call discovery. Now, discovery means they can say, all right, get all this information. And one of the discovery pieces was about the pledge versus donate. And they got the ACLU on the stand and said, hey, did she actually donate? And they said no. And they got the Children's Hospital, did they donate? No. And these things were crucial to her losing the case. Obviously, ACLU was more important than the Children's Hospital, but the fact that she didn't donate to either of them, or not very much, means that she was lying about that. And so those sorts of discovery didn't happen in the UK. So, and to put that into perspective, the UK trial was 2 weeks, US 6, 3 times as much. They got through a lot more stuff. They got to a lot more nitty gritties. The other thing is that there is an avenue for them both to be correct. If you take the view that the son didn't lie, she lied to the son. Nothing, the son didn't do anything wrong. They're just repeating her lie. They didn't know it was a lie. Not defamation. If they don't know it's a lie, it's not defamation. It has to be in order to meet the criteria for defamation, it has to be knowingly false. So if they honestly believe it to be true and are stating it to be true, it's not defamation. Even if what they're saying is false. And that's all that they proved. They proved that they had not done any defamation. They didn't even ask if Amber Heard had. All they had to say was that what Amber Heard said was consistent with what they said. And that was what was proven. There was no, even though you might read the judge's comments and say, oh, it says it's okay to be a wife beater. No. He didn't have that level of knowledge. He couldn't know that because Amber Heard wasn't actually tested on that to the level required of that. And this is where people sometimes get a bit confused. They're like, oh, the judge said that he's a wife beater. No, the judge said, he might have said that, but what he meant was that the Sun newspaper honestly believed him to be a wife beater. Now, you might say, oh, based on this case, if we put the two together, they should change the judge's remarks, but they don't really need to. So, with that basis, you've got to say, well, actually, that's just bad. This is a bad argument when she's saying, you know, this is why this case shouldn't be heard. It's a bad argument. Now, it'd be a good argument if she was actually sued. It'd be quite a good argument because it is fair enough to argue it is pretty much the same situation. But it is different because she's being sued. And to put that into perspective, let's imagine that out of this trial, the one they had in the US, they then say, okay, well, Amber Heard, we found out that you now lied. We're going to sue you for perjury. And they would go over much the same cases, much the same situation, and they would say, well, you lied you committed perjury in the UK case. We're now going to sue you for that. We're going to not sue you, but charge you. Be criminal trial. They wouldn't be able to say, oh, but that's different because it's got a different angle. And they could, by the way, they could sue her for perjury. Adam Waldman put in a complaint to police about it. So absolutely could sue them, could charge her with perjury. And, absolutely allowed to. She could still be charged with perjury. Well, I think she has been charged with perjury in Australia. They want to charge her. I don't think they've quite got there. I think they're waiting for these appeals and all this sort of stuff to see what the result is. But it seems like they will in Australia. But I don't know for sure that she'll definitely be found guilty. That's a separate trial. But they're separate trials. So even though they're covering a lot of the same issues, they're separate trials. So as I said in my separate video on this, I think this has no chance of success. None. Now, I say effectively none. And this is something I didn't clarify in my separate video, was that, yes, there is a possibility that I've missed some legal argument on this, but it's already been tried. They've already had discussions about this, and it's already been found that, no, there's a separate case. And yeah, perfectly reasonable to say this is essentially the same issue. It's perfectly reasonable to say there's a different court and they can't use US to appeal a UK judgment. But they're both perfectly reasonable. But she wasn't a defendant in the UK, and she was in the US. So that's why this case will not win. This argument will not win. So now I'm going to go into the second argument. So the second argument was that it should have been tried in California. Now the reason for this she said, or her team has said, she was living in California and Johnny Depp was living in California and all the damage was done in California. Therefore, it should have been held in California. What? First of all, she actually wrote the article in New York. That's where the ACLU's office are. So physically, she did the defamation in New York. So it should be tried in New York, not Virginia or California. So why is Virginia a good argument and a good place? The reason is because the Washington Post, who published the article, was in Virginia. So in other words, it was created in New York but published in Virginia. And the idea that her being living in California has anything to do with that being a reason for holding it there is ridiculous because where she lives and where he lives, it doesn't have anything to do with it. Fact is that these were distributed worldwide and the defamation occurred worldwide. So, yeah, sure, he was working for Hollywood mostly, which was mostly in California. But, I mean, he was doing these movies in Australia and other parts of the world, and other people all around the world were watching them. So there's really very limited scope to suggest California. In fact, there's probably a better argument to suggest New York. And the reason why neither of them wanted New York was because, well, Johnny Depp was a better chance of winning in Virginia because of their anti-SLAPP laws. And anti-SLAPP, and I've had to try to get my head around this. This is essentially saying that you're allowed to defame people to a certain level, and that if you want to prove defamation, you have to prove it without getting this thing called discovery. We got in the first point there. So if it had been held in California, most likely she would have won. Of course, she was most likely going to win in Virginia. She would have won in New York. He had to win by having a massive argument that was just so overwhelmingly strong that he still won in spite of all the odds against him. I put that as 20,000 to 1 was his chances of winning. So pretty amazing that he won, even in Virginia. If he'd been fighting in California, it would have been more like 1 million to 1. But one reason why this argument doesn't hold weight is right now, if they were to transfer, if they did the appeal and then they said, well, let's hold it in California now, they've already had discovery. He'd still win in California on appeal because they already know. And they say, oh, you've won. So that's the problem. And it's not only that, but let's say that the original judge allowed them to have it in California, which, as we explained previously, the best argument is actually New York. Neither side wanted New York, but the best argument was New York. The second best argument was Virginia, and the worst argument was California out of three, because there was nowhere else that was possible. So Virginia was essentially acting as a medium, an in-between. But she wanted California and he wanted Virginia, and they went with Virginia, which is obviously upsetting for her because she would have would have been a much better chance of winning in California. But on the law, that doesn't really matter. It's sort of the connection to the case. The best argument was New York. And so if she was arguing now and wanted it changed, she would say, well, it should have been held in New York. But it wouldn't have changed the outcome if it was in New York versus Virginia. It would have changed the outcome if it was in California. But the fact that it would have changed that outcome doesn't mean that it should be appealed or changed on appeal, because the reason it would have changed the outcome is because California wouldn't have listened to all the facts. And when you look at an appeal, so let's say that it was held in California based on that argument, which would have been a poor argument. But nonetheless, let's say that the original decision had it in California and she'd won because there was none of this. If he then went to appeal, he would win because he would argue that, hey, actually, if you had all of that, I would have won. And he would have an appeal, he would have that granted, and it would then be held probably in New York. And since he won in Virginia, he probably would have won in New York. You would have had a retrial. So the fact that had that happened would have been appealed and would have been granted on appeal means that this is it's an awful argument. This is, I said the first one had no chance of success. I'd say this one is even worse than that because even if they granted it, which they shouldn't, But even if they granted this, if you held it now in California, which is the only outcome they could have, they couldn't just change it and say, "Oh, she wins because it should have been held in California," and they don't allow um, discovery because of the anti-SLAPP laws. It wouldn't work because even without discovery, they've had discovery now. They can't undo the clock and say, "Oh, all this evidence we have doesn't exist now." Because let's say that they had all the evidence already and they went to California, he would win in California. So they've got that already. So this has got no chance of winning. This is less than no chance. This is negative. This is no, no. So now I'm going to go into the third one. So the third one is the medical records. So by medical record, she means psychiatric records. Now, I'm going to start this off by saying how normal domestic violence cases work. So most domestic violence cases, at least the ones I've been involved in, and again, as like a paralegal sort of thing, when I've dealt with them, and I've had, I think it's 178 of them, the vast majority of them, in fact, everyone that I can remember, has come through with physical injuries. Now, that just might be that they're the cases that I end up trying because the ones without them don't get to court or they're dealt with in a different way. But the ones that have physical injuries doesn't mean that they win. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible to win without physical injuries, but I'm saying that the ones that I dealt with all had physical injuries. So when they had physical injuries, yes, the majority won, but it wasn't a big majority. It was more like 55% that would win with physical injuries. And I'm not going to worry about the ones that won, because the ones that won, in my opinion, were correct to win. They were ones where the culprit had hurt them. And there weren't very many where they were men that were the victims, but there were a few. And there weren't very many where women were the culprits, but there were a few. But they're very much in the minority. Again, I can go over discrimination in the criminal justice system, but we also have the fact that men are physically stronger than women. So you probably would expect men to physically assault women more than women would assault men. And I think that would be the case that you would expect. Nonetheless, we get into the case. I'm going to now look at the 45% who lost. And why did they lose? They had physical injuries. And they had medical records of physical injuries. Now, the most common lot of these, I'm just going to do a statistical thing here. The most common ones that lost their cases, they lost them because the physical injuries were self-inflicted. And they had hit themselves, usually against kitchen cabinets, car doors, falling over, smashing themselves against walls and doors and stuff like that, usually to the face. And what you'd often have, you'd have these medical records, and you would go in there and you'd look at the medical records, and there'd be a little splinter in their face, and they'd be like, "How could you get a splinter in your face if someone punched you with their fist? Do they have wood on their fist? No, they don't. That means that it's self-inflicted." And you'd also have things like videos. You'd have security systems, and they'd show, oh, somebody, they were hitting themselves. Some of the people would hit themselves with their own fists, and you could see that. And some of them would get somebody else to hit them. They'd get their sister, their new boyfriend, their brother. Sometimes they'd even hire somebody to hit them. And you'd have all this evidence, and that's 45% that you'd have that. Sometimes you'd just have witnesses that would say it. And and then you'd get those ones where they say, well, maybe they were guilty, but they just paid a lot of witnesses. Maybe they did. Maybe there was some bad decisions there. So I'm not going to go into that, but I'm going to say that, in my view, these ones, I'm going to assume that they were all the correct judgments. And if they weren't, well, I'm actually going to say, well, statistically, men get the raw end of the deal in criminal justice systems. So I'm going to say that the numbers are actually probably worse than that. Because if you factor in the fact that 10 times as many men as women are in jail, and we should expect that they should be roughly 50-50, because men are no worse than women in terms of ethics. Just as many men are evil as women. Just as many men are good as women. Why would you expect that being male or being female would make you more evil or more good or more deserving of being in prison? It shouldn't make any difference. In fact, it's quite sexist to suggest that it does. So let's now look at that, and then we say, okay, so you have physical injuries don't lead to you winning a case. They do 55% of the time. 45% of the time they don't, right? Because they're the only ones I dealt with. Now, I'm not going to go into the ones which didn't have physical injuries because I never dealt with any of them. But the ones that did have physical injuries, only 55% won the case. And I'm assuming these were fair cases. If there were physical injuries here that were recorded and reported by medical professionals with CT scans and all that sort of stuff, would Amber Heard have won a case? And the simple answer is no, because we know that Amber Heard lied about all this, which has been proven. And we know that if she did have physical injuries, there would be video footage of it. East Columbia building is like a penthouse. It's really expensive. I have no doubt that they have security camera footage. And that security camera footage might be a bit blurry. It might not be very clear. But you would see her hitting herself against kitchen cabinets. So what would most likely happen if she was going to lie about it, she wouldn't do it in the East Columbia building. She would do it outside when Johnny Depp wasn't there, and probably would get her sister to do it because that's the most likely one, and she could trust her sister. Whitney would do it for her. Whitney would probably go, "Hey, yeah, I get some revenge. Yes, you're framing Johnny Depp, but anyway, I'll still do it. I like to hit you. The first time I get to hit my sister, yay!" I mean, there's two other options of what she could ask James Franco or Elon Musk as well. I can't imagine Elon Musk doing it, but James Franco probably wouldn't either, but he might. He's probably more likely. And that's just my opinion. I'm not in any way having a go at them, but I think most likely she'd ask her sister. Now that she did have those renter friends, but I don't think they would go that far. I think that would be something that would be too far for them. But she might ask them. Who knows? I might be wrong. She might have somebody else she'd ask. Who knows? I can't imagine her somehow doing it to herself. It's just sort of I don't imagine that. So I think she would probably be the kind that would get her sister to do it. So why didn't she? And I think the simple answer is that she wouldn't have got away with it because Johnny Depp is a famous person. So the people that I dealt with weren't famous people. They didn't have massive security. They didn't have video footage of everything. So you could probably get away with lying about things like that, but you couldn't in Johnny Depp's situation. Now, remember, Johnny Depp was not charged with anything. There was a temporary protection order or whatever it was, which requires zero evidence, but there was no actual charge. There's no proof of anything. So, you know, and then, so if they did have these physical records, if she had done it, and I'm going to assume that they were dishonest, would it have changed the view of the jury? And the simple answer is yes. Even though the jury would probably go there and go, she's lying, it would still change their view of it. And it would say, well, but she might be telling the truth. She's got these physical injuries. And we know that the majority of the time when people have physical injuries, that means they've been hurt 55% of the time. Maybe they don't know the percentages, but I think they generally have a view that that's probably telling the truth. They're probably told in the media that it's 90% because the media tend to exaggerate these things. 55% is the real number. But nonetheless, the majority of people with physical injuries in a domestic violence situation have actually been assaulted. So if they're going through that and they're looking at that, and the jury would probably be swayed. Would it be enough to win her the case? Probably not. Would it be enough to lead to a mistrial and a retrial? Possibly. Yeah. I mean, because they should have included it. Because if you had those physical injuries, it's enough of a change that you should be including it. So I think that you wouldn't award it to Amber, but you would offer a retrial. So if that was the case, and that was all you were doing, I would say it would influence the jury a little bit, and there would be serious consideration to do a retrial. Would it happen? I don't think so, because all the evidence suggests that she was lying about the whole thing. But if the evidence was a bit more ambiguous, I think you would. And you still might, even with this obvious dishonesty by her, you still might. So I'd probably put that at about 5%, 10%, around about that figure for them doing a retrial if she had physical injuries and if that's what the medical records were. Now we know that isn't what the medical records are, but I just wanted to put that into perspective. So if this had been an ambiguous case in which it was a bit on the border and you weren't sure, so if, for example, he'd only won on one count and only got $1 million and lost on the others, and she got all the counter claims and all these different things, and people weren't sure, and you were having 50-50 divide on the internet and all that sort of stuff. If you had that and you had physical injuries that were not included when they should be by law, because it is influential, you would probably order a retrial with the physical injuries included. So, because this is not that kind of 50-50 case, this is more like a 95-5 case, a 20-1 case, you wouldn't. But you still might. So I'm putting that at about 5%. Now, then we get to the next bit, because we know it wasn't physical injuries. We know that what was excluded were, and what she's calling medical records, were actually her talking to a psychiatrist. Now you compare for a moment. You're trying to frame somebody for domestic violence. In your framing, you have the choice of smashing your head against a car door, against a cupboard, against a door, hitting yourself, getting your sister to hit you, having actual pain and soreness, or just telling someone some lie. What's harder? Physical injuries? You have to put up with all that in order to frame somebody? We just tell a lie. Well, pretty obvious. Telling a lie is a lot easier. It's less painful. She just tells some lies to some people. And she's clearly good at lying. So it's not, actors are liars. That's pretty much what actors do. Actors are paid liars. I remember I heard that from, I think it was Robin Williams, who's unfortunately passed away. But yeah, you're paid liars. So you'd expect actors to be better liars than most people in the world. And if she puts on a face. Now what motivation would she have to lie about this? Well, 35 million, also 33.5 million is what she got from her divorce. 7 million in cash, the other bit, and various other things. So it's a big motivation. Plus, this enhanced her career because all of her big roles she got after this, and because of this, it enhanced her reputation. She wanted to hurt him, and in fact, you could almost say that this was a bit of a security for her. So she was telling psychiatrists and psychologists, oh yeah, blah, 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 blah. Because then if he ever leaves her, she can hurt him. And that's not really unbelievable. I mean, this is the thing, and I go over to domestic violence cases. So a lot of the ones that are proven to be true, right? A lot of them won't go to anyone while they're being abused. That's quite common, they don't. Some do, but most don't. But what you'll often have with your medical record for the ones that are true is that you will get, they've gone to the doctor and said, oh, I just ran into a door. And there's no splinter in their face. So they're lying to protect the person. And when you go into trial, you go and you look at those previous medical records, which were said to be, oh, running into a door, I'm clumsy, I've fallen over. But they weren't. And they were suspected to be domestic violence at the time. And if you look, and there are some people that will do that at the time in a false way. But it's quite easy to prove in most cases. The more common, the ones that are lying have just done it at the time. They've just ran into a door then, and then they go to court that day, or they go to the police that day. They hurt themselves, and then 5 minutes later they go to police. So they want to make sure they've got all the bruises all fresh. So, if you're going to lie, you usually lie on the day. You don't normally have this big setup. But that's if you're doing physical injuries. And it has been known to do physical injuries in advance the whole way through as a setup. If you don't want somebody to leave or you want to hurt them, you've got that motivation. And she certainly had motivation to make sure that she got everything from him. So, but would this convince a jury? Now I've said physical medical records would a little bit. Probably wouldn't win her the case, but it would help a little bit. What about psychiatric things? It's a lot easier to lie. A lot of people lie to psychiatrists. They lie to psychologists. She's an actor. Actors lie. It's what they do. It's what they do for a living. So, is it believable that she would have lied? Yes. Is that a guarantee that juries would just ignore it? No, they would look at it and they would pay attention to it. And would it change their decision? It would influence their decision. Not as much, again, not as much as the physical medical records. Because I think most people know you can lie to a psychiatrist pretty easily. But it would show consistent statements. So how much would that influence the jury? And I'm saying maybe 1%, maybe 2%. It's around about that amount. It would influence them a little bit. But the other thing is, there's two other things. Number one is that actually they already kind of heard this. So if a judge in the Court of Appeal is going to look at that, they're going to go, oh, well, you actually already got pretty much this, but you didn't get the exact thing. And like when we look at the case of Adam Warburton out of context, and they should have put all the context in, these actual medical records would count as the context, even though they're psychiatric things. You could actually look at them, and it would make a little bit of a difference. And I'd say, by law, they should have included them. I think they should have included them. But the question is, would a judge in the Court of Appeal think that this was such a big influence that they should issue a retrial? They're certainly not going to award it to Amber Heard. Would they issue a retrial over something that's unlikely to make much of a difference? And the simple answer is no. But they still might. And they might. It's a possibility. So I would say about 5,001. I'd say it's really unlikely, but it's not impossible. This is probably her best chance of the four. I haven't gone into the others because, according to Andrew Burkhart, they're the four that matter. This is her best chance, and it's about 5,001. And because these are all independent, that therefore means that her chance of winning the appeal is 5,001. Johnny Depp's chance, once again, is 99.875%. I think I had. Her chances are 0.02%. I'm going to go over the fourth one anyway, because this is a bit of an interesting one. So the fourth one is on damages, and her claim is that the $10 million that he was awarded was excessive. So, in other words, even if she won all the other bits, she lost all the other bits, she shouldn't have had to pay as much as 10 million. How dare he suggest such a much? And she suggested that that was because they included bits from before 2008. So let's go over the facts there. First thing I'm going to look at financially, and this is my little numbers bit, is the divorce proceedings. So in the divorce proceedings, they showed that he had had earnings between 2015 and 2016 of $70 million. This was offset by Amber Heard's earnings of $3 million in those 2 years. So in other words, the difference was 67 million. Half of that was 33.5. And therefore, and I said before, he had to give her $33.5 million. $7 million of which was cash, $7 million of which was property, and blah, 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 blah. She got 33.5 million. All right. So, because his earnings were 70 million in 2 years, 35 million a year. So if we assume that those were the last two clean years, so we talk about clean years when we're doing statistics, it's what we do. We say the last two that were not altered by some other event. So if we then look at what would happen in the 6 years since then, assuming that those are the clean years, right? It was in 2016 she put in the restraining order, told lies to the son, and so forth. So we could assume that he would continue to have earned 35 million a year for 6 years. 35 times 6, 210 million. What is his actual earnings in those 6 years? I don't actually know, but let's say 15, 20 million. So if he was not counting the UK judgment and not counting the 2016 bid, he should have asked for $190 million. Roundabout. So the fact that he only asked for 50, what he asked for is irrelevant to this case, but he only asked for 50. The fact that he was only granted 10 kind of proves that this didn't have this. He wasn't asking for this since the 2016. That figure does not represent 2016 to 2020. In 2022, it doesn't even represent from 2018 to 2022 if we assume that 16 to 18 is closed off because of the UK judgment. So, because if we went from 2018 to 2022 and assumed that those were clean years, we still have 4 times 35 million, 140 million. Minus a little bit for what he actually earned, let's say 130 million. He was granted 10. So that argument, false. It's wrong. So why did we get 10 million? So the jury were given all the information about why 50 million was fair. And they talked about what he was going to be earning and all that in the period from 2018 to 2022. So they talked about Pirates of the Caribbean movies, all these other things. They didn't talk about the Harry Potter because that was in the 2016 to 2018 period. They didn't actually mention anything before 2018. And the jury decided, as they're allowed to, instead of 50 million, they went down to 10 million. How they decide that, I don't know. I wasn't privy to that information, but they're allowed to decide that. So, once again, if he was going from 2016, it would have been 190 million. And they would have awarded that. So if the Sun judgment, if we pretend that Johnny Depp had never sued the Sun, there'd never been a UK trial, and that wasn't a part of this, he would have asked for 190 million, and I would guess he would get it. Right? 190, not 10. 190. And arguably, because the UK trial only proved that Amber lied to the Sun, arguably they should have included from the 2016, and arguably Johnny Depp should have got 190 million. But because Amber Heard's team quite cleverly argued that they should assume that he did the wrong thing from 2016 to 2018, and I'd say that's appealable, by the way. I'd say he should have asked for 190 million because that was not about his guilt. That was just about whether the Sun believed Amber. But nonetheless, they didn't appeal it. He could have appealed that. He could have asked for more money. He didn't. Why didn't he? I don't think he wanted more money. I don't think this is that hard an argument to argue, but he didn't ask for it. So 190 million would have been that. 130 million would have been the figure had he assumed the UK judgment hadn't happened, but we're only talking about 4 years instead of 6. So he didn't ask for 190, didn't ask for 130, was only granted 10. And the jury had every right to decide that it was 10. I don't know how they decided, but they had every right to decide that it was 10. They only gave him 1/5 of what I think he proved quite clearly was his actual loss. Amber Heard, by the way, she asked for 100 million, didn't show that at all. Had no attempt to show that. She was just saying, oh, well, if you'd have followed on from Jason Momoa and Zendaya and all that, then she would have had 100 million. Really? Based on what Adam Waldman said? That really cost you that much? No. She didn't prove any damages at all. I'd argue the 2 million was completely nonsense based on the damages part alone. Johnny Depp didn't even ask for that in his appeal. So, basic thing, it's not going to be reduced. There's no chance of that. But, here's a little thing. Would the Court of Appeals argue that actually he should have asked for 190 million, given that the UK case wasn't about her? He could have. But he didn't ask for that. The Court of Appeal can't award what they weren't asked to do. So he can't get 190 million. He also can't get 130 for the same reason. But what they can do is that they're both talking about money in their appeals. So he's saying he wants that 2 million removed. I don't see any reason why they wouldn't grant that. I've already gone over that. 99.8725% I think I had. 2 million's wiped off. But she's also said, well, that 10 million's too high. But what did the jury actually ask for? The jury said 15 million. They didn't say 10. There was a technicality in the Virginian law which said the punitive damages can be no higher than $350,000. They actually gave him 5. So the Court of Appeal, it is open to them to grant him that 5. But to put that on the other side and to say, well, effectively the jury wanted him to get 15 million. We can now have that as 15 million in what he lost, because we know that he lost at least 15 million. We know that he lost 190 million. He's not asking for 190, but it is open to the Court of Appeal to award him 15. And I think that's what's going to happen. I would say, and I haven't heard real big appeals on this, but because they're both in agreement that the amount was wrong, I think that the Court of Appeal will change it from being 10.3 million offset by 2, therefore 8.3, up to what the jury actually asked for, which is 15. They will remove the 2 million because that was based on poor information, and they will simply award Johnny Depp 15 million in losses because they will say you had losses that were more than that. We're going to give you 15 million. It is open to the Court of Appeal to do that. They can't go up to 190 because he didn't ask for that. They can't go up to 130 because he didn't ask for that. Even though he had every opportunity to appeal that, he could have appealed that. I don't know if he would have won. I would have had to look at it, but I would say if he'd gone to either 130 or 190, there is every chance that the Court of Appeal would have listened to that and perhaps put a number between that and what he was actually granted on the basis that the UK judgment was about something else. That was about whether the Sun were guilty of lying, not about whether Amber Heard was. And on that basis, he should have been allowed to use the 2016. He should have been allowed. So their argument that he did go to 2016 when he clearly didn't is faulty. They could, and the other problem is he should have been allowed to go to 2016 on that basis, and he didn't. But he should have been allowed to, and he really lowballed this. So I think that what will probably happen from that, and I'm going to put this at 75%. 75% chance is that they will increase it from 10 million to 15 million. I don't think they'll go higher than that because they're not allowed to, because Johnny Depp's side haven't asked for it. They'll go from 10 million to 15 million. They'll remove Johnny Depp's 2 million, and it'll go from 8.3 that Amber Heard owes up to 15. And it'll go from 3 wins for Johnny and 1 for Amber to, well, effectively 4 wins for Johnny and none for Amber, because she'll lose that appeal bit. And there is a chance, though, that the Court of Appeal will keep it. I think that's a chance. It's about a 25% chance that they will just keep it as is, at least for that side of things. And he'll stay at 10 plus the $350,000 in punitive damages. So stick at 10.3 and again remove that 2 from the other side. So overall, and I'm going to combine these, my conclusion, what I think will probably happen. So I've gone over it. I think most likely Johnny Depp will win his appeal on the first boundary, the first step, which is saying Adam Waldman did not represent Johnny Depp. He was just doing his own thing. But I also think they'll then say, well, even if he was, it was an opinion, and the jury should have been shown it unredacted. Now, I think with Amber Heard's side, and they'll remove that 2 million. What I think what they'll do from Amber Heard's side is that they will say, okay, UK judgment's already been decided, we're not going to go into that. The Virginian thing, that's already been decided. If you had argued about New York, we would have considered it, but makes no difference. Even if you go to California, it makes no difference. We're not going to consider that. They're going to look at the medical records and they're going to say, yes, they should have allowed it. And I think that'll be the conclusion. They should have allowed it. But they're not going to order a retrial on that when it has such a low prospect. And so they're not going to do a retrial. It's a big trial and it's such a big amount. So they're going to not allow that. And I think with the amount, I think that they will change it from 10 to 15 based on Amber Heard's. It might seem cruel to do that, but that is not a high amount considering how much Johnny Depp actually lost. He actually lost $190 million. He was only asking for 50, a quarter of what he actually lost. And he was only granted 10 million, which is 5% of what he lost. It's not lowballing. It's not excessive. It's lowballing. And I think the Court of Appeal will probably say that, and they'll say we could have gone all the way up to $190 million if Johnny Depp had asked. But because he didn't ask, we're only going up to what the jury said, and the jury said 15. We're going to go back to 15. We're going to have faith in the jury that the jury got it right. They're going to accept that. So I think that's what will happen. Now, I also think there's a good chance that Amber Heard will drop it, but considering Johnny Depp has got this now, he is going to continue with it. I don't think we're going to reach a little handshake thing. I think we're going to go all the way. Now, there is a little thing on the side with the travelers insurance. Travelers insurance seem to love Amber Heard, so they're going to just pay for the whole lot. I don't know why she's even caring about New York Marine. They're only in the hole for $1 million. In the end, she'll just allow them to get out of it. Who cares? And I think New York Marine should pay the $1 million, by the way, but I don't think she should really care. And yeah, will Johnny Depp collect the money? Probably not. He's indicated he doesn't care. And why would he care? He lost. He actually lost 190 million. Plus, he lost 520 million. Was something that happened, and he lost another 33.5 to her in divorce. If he was interested in the money, he would have sued her for divorce and got all that back. No worries, because she mentioned stuff and she wasn't allowed to mention. That's easy to prove. If he cared about the money, he would have got it from that. And you know, so yeah, I do think that Amber Heard will win on the. Well, I think that she'll get a technical win on the um, medical records, but I don't think that they'll actually allow that because the difference is so minor and it would be so disruptive to do it that they won't. So she'll be told technically, yes, it should have been included. They made the mistake there. But it's also, they did include most of it, so it's not that bad. And it wouldn't have made a big difference. I really can't imagine the jury changing their mind on that, given everything else. And given that there is a strong possibility, I'd say guarantee, that she lied about that. And there's other evidence associated with that. And I think they'll probably go over that in the appeal between both sides. But she'll get it. That is the most meritorious part of her entire argument. The medical records bit is the most meritorious. The damages bit is technically more meritorious, but it should actually go up, not down. And I actually think that will go up. Because that's easy for them to do. They don't have to issue a new trial for the damages amount to go up, and they'll do it. They'll just say, "Yeah, we're going to go up." I'm not sure if Johnny Depp's team are allowed to say, "Well, it actually should have been 190." Um, but if they are allowed to, they might. They may well say, "Sorry, Amber, if you're worried about being 10 million in trouble, we're going to make you 190." You will never get any money out of anything. But that's really quite vindictive and quite cruel, and I don't think that was the point of this. The point of this is to clear his name. He has not collected any money from her. She has not had to declare bankruptcy. He's allowing her to live a life. He just wants to clear his name. That therefore means that she's been quite vindictive with this and with the appeal. She shouldn't be doing the appeal, and really she should be dropping it. It's really quite questionable why she's doing it. I don't think it's a good idea at all. Um, she can use. Anyway, this is quite an important case for the world. I've got to say that. But anyway, as for their replies, I'm aware that Amber Heard has had her reply. I haven't found the documents for that, and I really want to look at the original documents to see the merits of her response to Johnny Depp. I'm not on top of that yet, so I'm not ready for a video on that yet. Anyway, that's it from me. Bye bye.